As I've mentioned before, I've been working on a Pecha Kucha presentation for a graduate colloquium. It has very specific genre conventions, which I broke from the get-go by not using PowerPoint but Adobe Express Video, because I knew in advance that I wanted the medium or how I share the final product to be YouTube. Right? So beyond giving the presentation in person, I wanted it to be YouTube. The other conventions for a Pecha Kucha are 20 slides, 20 seconds each slide, and 6 words or less. So like very visually driven. This presentation, because it was designated for a graduate colloquium and because it gives a broad bird's eye view of my dissertation plans in progress, has a specific intended audience. Much like you and your multimodal compositions have a very specific intended audience. So for me, it was graduate students and professors working in the field of rhetorical and composition studies. However, I could see how a secondary audience might be other humanities academics or just generally people who are interested in medicine, psychiatry, cultural studies, as well as those interested in ethnography as a method of inquiry. My third audience, for which I made further revisions, and if time allowed at this point, would make even more revisions, are you. You are my audience now, my undergraduate students working on multimodal composition projects. Now, because I wanted to share this with you to expand on my own rhetorical choices and give you some ideas for how to articulate the relationship between audience and those choices in your own essays and oral presentations, I broke the rules and added additional slides to make up for the fact that my bio and my project's description were actually read and introduced before the live presentation I gave on Friday. My own multimodal composition is a remix of the introduction to my dissertation proposal. Acknowledging my primary audience as people who work within my field, I chose to forgo defining certain terms in a lot of detail. Those include affect, public or collective feelings, stigma, rhetoricity, arhetoricity, ethos, performative writing, and autoethnography. I made this choice with the assumption that most in my audience would be familiar with their meaning in the context of my work in order to make the most of the limited time I had to fit the genre conventions of a Pecha Kucha, which, by the way, I hit 6 minutes and 40 seconds on the dot. I was very proud of myself. Now, the beginning slide features a spiral background as well as font colors that do not necessarily mesh together. And I did this to reflect the content of my presentation as I speak about the rhetorical loops that Western medicine takes us on. You'll also notice that I chose to recycle multiple slides throughout the presentation. I did this intentionally in order to make the transition before and after I recite the poem as smooth and as impactful as possible. In other words, despite the time constraints, the affordances of the Pecha Kucha as a genre also allowed me to help the audience make connections between the theory itself and how the poem reflects this theory simply through the repetition of these visuals, these slides. The poem not only makes multiple cultural references which speak to the collective nature of the phenomenon, it also highlights the loopiness of the accrual of madnesses by medicine. At the same time, starting and ending my presentation with the same slides likewise boosts the idea of that loop, that cycle. So very specific, intended, formal choices that I made here. While during my presentation, before I shared the poem, I made just a brief comment about profanity, because I further revised the presentation for you, young undergraduate students, I decided to add a 10-second slide to ensure a proper trigger warning. And if I were to further revise this presentation for my third audience, you, that is, I would likely begin with those terms that I did not define and add more information about the project. Importantly, I will note here that once I began revising the Pecha Kucha for you, I got farther and farther and farther away from the genre's conventions. And if I were to further revise, I don't think we could call the presentation a Pecha Kucha anymore, but a visual essay, which would no longer hold me to the strict conventions of the Pecha Kucha genre.
Hi, my name is Zuzanna Koziatek. I am a fifth year English PhD student with a concentration in rhetoric. My research sits at the intersection of the rhetoric of health and medicine, disability rhetoric, feminist studies, and affect theory. In this presentation, I will share a bird's eye view of the theory I call madness by medicine. I will demonstrate it in action through my poetry, which, in the context of my forthcoming dissertation, acts as an autoethnographic vehicle for new knowledge creation. I reclaim madness as a word, considering my own positionality as someone with multiple psychiatric and somatic diagnoses that, in my opinion, are less mad or maddening or anxiety or frustration inducing than what some aspects of medicine end up producing. Madness by Medicine is a public feeling cluster to describe the ever spiraling rainbow of collective feelings, much like symptoms, that on an individual basis become more and more evident with proximity to medicine and the accrual of rhetorical exchanges that simply go nowhere or leave us anxious, dazed, confused, in disbelief, exhausted, resigned. The poem embodies and demonstrates the theory in action, leading me to explore the rhizomatic nature of this phenomenon, questioning the cultural connections which ultimately lead to the production of various rhetorical failures when we encounter parts of the medical triad. I intend to highlight the lived side effects of these failures, these overflows of madnesses by medicine across multiple sites, from the recovery center and the primary care provider's office to the health insurance phone line, with the hope of finding pockets of collective rhetorical resistance. Ultimately, I hope my investigations help restore lost patient ethos from our positioning as objects to our restoration of individual agency and rhetoricity.